Hello and welcome back to another video for WJEC Eduqas A-Level Religious Studies. In this video we're going to start the final theme for ethics, ethics theme 4, by looking at predestination. So, first of all, what is the idea of original sin and concupiscence and how does this link to predestination? So we're going to look first at a man named Augustine. So St. Augustine, as we can see on the right, was the Bishop of Hippo from 396 to 430 AD. Before becoming a Christian, he lived a hedonistic lifestyle and was also a dualist Manichaean. Effectively what that means is that he lived for pleasure and he believed that there were like a force of good and a force of evil in the universe that were like equally balanced, and he did not believe in the traditional idea of God in Christianity, for example. However, due to Platonist influence, he came to be a great Christian thinker involved in the Pelagian controversy, which was centered around the doctrine of justification and God's grace. So there was a debate between Augustine later on and a man named Pelagius, who we'll look at in a future video, about how is one saved? How does one attain salvation? How is one made right with God? And what role does God's grace play in salvation? And Augustine and Pelagius took very different views to that question. In response to Pelagius' view that God's grace was not the only means to attain salvation, Augustine formulated the official church teaching on grace, the fall, so of Adam and Eve, and also predestination, mainly in his work The City of God. Augustine's first point then for his predestination theory was the doctrine of original sin, which is based on the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, the story that we all know. So Adam and Eve were created with an original righteousness, okay? So in the state they were initially created, they were created, in a sense, morally perfect. They had no moral faults or moral blemishes within them when they were initially created. But they also had the choice, along with that original righteousness, they had the choice, the ability, the capacity to disobey God and to contravene his commands. And when they did so, right, when they eat the fruit and listen to the serpent over God, this resulted in a corruption in all humanity. Okay, so not just in Adam and Eve, but in all of their offspring. Original sin is thus a defect in human nature, right? It's inherent to us, which makes people want to sin, meaning we are born with weakened faculties and a tendency to choose evil because of this corrupt nature that we've inherited from Adam and Eve. Since we are all seminally present in the loins of Adam, right? We're all descended from Adam, effectively, is that what that means? We are all born as a massa peccati, which means a lump of sin, okay? Implying that our ability to freely choose the good is impeded by our sinful nature. So thanks to what Adam and Eve did, we are now born with this defect. We are born with this corrupt nature, and that means that when we are deliberating should we choose good or evil, it makes it harder for us to choose the good because we are more inclined to do the evil thing. This inclination towards natural things and away from God, right, towards the evil over the good, is called concupiscence. And it is the effect of Adam's sin that is transmitted to each of us through procreation, though concupiscence is not itself a sin. So concupiscence, again, is the inclination we have towards evil over good, the inclination towards natural things over God, and it's transmitted by natural birth. And so we all inherit it, but it's not itself a sin. And only God's grace, which is an unmerited gift, meaning something we don't deserve, can set us free from the bonds of death that we are stuck in as a result of Adam's transgression. So we need God's grace to effectively rescue us from our concupiscence and from our corrupt nature. This teaching is consistent with Romans 3, and many Protestant reformers emphasised it with their doctrines of sola gratia, meaning grace alone, so God's grace alone saves, and also they came up with the idea of sola fide, or faith alone, that faith alone saves, for the Protestant reformers. And so the idea is that salvation is a gift from God. We are in a state of sin, a state of corruption, and then God, in his grace, decides to save us because he is merciful and loving. And for Augustine, God's grace is applied to us in the sacrament of baptism, which regenerates the individual, meaning it brings them back to life. They're in a state of death due to sin, but baptism, which dispenses God's grace, brings the person who is baptized to life, okay, spiritual life. It also cleanses them from a stain of original sin. So remember, we're all born with this stain, this concupiscence, this original sin, and baptism for Augustine washes that away. This idea is also expressed in the Nicene Creed. Okay, so the Nicene Creed is the document that the Christian Church formulated in the early 4th century to basically compile what they believe. Okay, and it states in the Nicene Creed that baptism is for the forgiveness of sins. So original sin is removed, it's done away with, but that doesn't mean that the inclination to do evil, which is concupiscence, remains. Or rather, is got away with, okay? That still remains. So there is a distinction between the original sin, okay, which is washed away by baptism, and the concupiscence or the inclination to do evil, which baptism does not do away with completely. Okay, and so even after you're baptized, you are not never going to sin again. You'll still have that inclination, but baptism washes you from your original sin and gives you God's grace. Okay, so what did Augustine believe about the will? We've looked at what he believed about original sin and concupiscence. Okay, what on earth has that got to do with predestination? Okay, the idea that God has an action or has a role in human actions. Okay, how does that also relate to the idea of the human will? You know, is it humans who are acting freely? Is God forcing them to do things? Is there a mixture of the two? What does Augustine say about this? So he says that in our fallen state, due to our original sin, the human will has become wounded, yet it still exists. So although we have free will, it's effectively in bondage and slavery to our sinful nature. So God does create us free because we are made in his image and God is free himself. But our will is not absolutely free. Okay, it's not 100% free will because of our sin, our sinful nature, which inhibits it, weakens it, and means that we are effectively in slavery to sin. Okay, but we're not necessarily obliged to sin to the point where our will has no say at all. We can still resist it, but it becomes a lot harder. So we are a massa peccati, a mass of sin, but we nonetheless have a liberium arbitrium, which is a free will. Okay, so we have these two sort of things that may seem opposing, right? A lump of sin and free will. Yeah, we do. We have them both. So we can determine our own actions. So we do have free will. That's true. But due to concupiscence, we've lost the absolute moral liberty or libertas. Okay, so we're not totally free to choose the good. So before Adam and Eve sinned, they had this libertas. They had this full moral liberty. They didn't have concupiscence or original sin, so their will was fully free. But as a result of their sin, them and all of their descendants, including us, have lost this full liberty and now have a weakened yet still free will. Our concupiscence then, which still remains within us, predisposes us to evil, makes us more likely to do evil, and so resisting temptation becomes a lot harder, but it's not impossible because we still have the will to resist it. So by ourselves, though, we cannot choose the good because of this concupiscence, and so, as we've already seen, we need God to liberate us from this concupiscence, from this evil inclinations that we have by his grace, by his unmerited gift of grace. R.C. Sproul summarizes Augustine's teaching on the will, saying this: our desires are dominated by our evil impulses. So our desires, our will, technically we're in control of. Okay, we do have a free ability, a free will to choose our own actions, but because of the effect of Adam and Eve's sin, our concupiscence, our original sin, they are now, our desires, as Sproul says, are dominated by our evil impulses, and it becomes a lot harder for us to choose the good, but we still can. Okay, so that's what he believes about the will. But what did he teach then, rounding it all together, about predestination? God's grace, which is a divine gift given to humans, flowing from his love, is at the heart of Augustine's worldview. We've already seen this. When God chooses to give a man grace, he changes his desires and alters his nature so that he will freely obey him and choose the good. Okay, that's the important bit. When he decides to give a man grace, right, we're here, we're stuck in the bonds of death, but then God looks down upon us and saves us, right, gives us his grace through baptism and through the sacraments. What he does is those, like Sproul says, those desires which are dominated by evil, he changes them. And he alters the nature, which obviously is corrupt and dirty and evil due to sin, okay, or you know, in a fallen state. He alters that nature and restores it to effectively how it was before the fall. Okay, so he brings us back. He restores us to the state that we were initially created in, and that allows us what? If you think about the will as being dirtied and inhibited by our sin, by our sinful nature, then God's grace washes away that dirt. It washes away that sinful nature that we have. And so then, as a result, our freedom is able to flourish. We are able to actually freely do the good and obey him. Now, grace is given to all who are baptized, as we've seen, because original sin is washed away. But God gives more grace to those whom he chooses to save. So there will be some people who receive baptism, but ultimately will not remain Christians, it will fall away, and they will not be saved, and so maybe they haven't received the fullness of God's grace. But those who do persevere until the end have received the fullness of God's grace, right? They've received more grace, and they are the ones whom he chooses to save. The Bible says in Ephesians 1:4 that God chose us, meaning the believers, in him before the creation of the world. And so it is God who predestines who will be saved. So it's God who does the choosing. You're going to be saved, you're not. Other passages discussing predestination used by Augustine and Calvin, as we'll see in a second, include Romans 8:28-30 and John 15:16. So if you're interested in the biblical sort of evidence for predestination, if you like, then read those passages. Those fortunate then to receive God's grace, right, the ones whom he predestines to be saved, are called the elect. Okay, they've been effectively elected, chosen to be saved by God's grace. Whereas those who suffer the effects of concupiscence, right, who remain in their sins and are not saved by God's grace, are known as the reprobates. There is debate, though, around whether Augustine affirmed what is called single predestination, okay, which is the idea that he only chose those who would be saved, or whether he affirmed double predestination, the idea that God also chose those who would be damned. So, effectively, what that means is God, when it says in Ephesians 1, God chose us in him before the creation of the world, is he just choosing who's going to be saved and ignoring the ones he doesn't choose and just leaving them? Or is he choosing those who he's going to save and also actively choosing those who he is going to damn and saying, I'm going to damn you and I'm going to save you? Okay. Some say he affirms double predestination, whereas others think he only affirms single. In other words, he only argues that God chooses those who will be saved, but just ignores the damned. Okay, so there's a subtle distinction there. But McGrath argues that Augustine taught that the damned, right, those are the reprobates, those who will end up in hell, weren't actively chosen to go to hell, but they just weren't chosen to be saved. So God, perhaps randomly or for some reason out of our knowledge, chooses certain individuals to be saved and he gives them his grace. And McGrath thinks that for Augustine, those whom he doesn't, choose to be saved, he doesn't actively damn them, he just chooses not to save them. Okay? Sort of like ignores them, passes them by. John Lennox, however, thinks that it's difficult to affirm single predestination without logically affirming double predestination, as God would surely have known who would go to hell. So it seems a bit weird if God just chooses who would be saved and just ignores the damned, because surely he knows that they're going to be damned. Why didn't he save those people? Or, why does he only choose certain people to be saved over others? Doesn't that show that he's not fully loving? That's a potential, criticism of this type of predestination. Regardless, an obvious problem with Augustine's view of predestination, as we've seen, is its implications on God's loving character, right? Because he only chooses to save some, as we just said. If on the one hand, God saving some shows his mercy, then why does he not save everyone? That would be an even more plentiful show of his mercy. Or on the other hand, if he predestines those he knew would accept his grace, right? So if he's actually just predestining those who he knew would respond to him, well, then this contradicts the whole point of Augustine's theory, because it's God's grace alone that saves, independent of man's response. So it's God that is doing the saving, not man. So that is the idea that Augustine has. Remember, we started with the idea of original sin and concupiscence, which inhibits our will. Yet we still do have that free will. And then God, in his grace, chooses to save some of us, the elect. And there's debate whether or not he actively damns the reprobates or whether they are just passed by and left to their sins. But that's the idea of predestination that Augustine taught. Okay, another type of predestination we're going to look at is the type taught by a man named John Calvin. So what did he teach about predestination and God's sovereignty? Here he is, John Calvin. He was a French Protestant reformer from the 16th century who introduced some new ideas about grace, the will, and predestination in his magnum opus, his most famous work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, where he mainly focuses on the sovereignty of God. So the sovereignty of God is the idea that God is totally in control. Okay, God is king, God is in control of everything. Okay, that he places a lot of emphasis on this idea. Calvinism, which is the school of thought named after his teachings, can be summarised in the acronym TULIP, which contains the 5 points of Calvinism developed in the Synod of Dort in the 17th century. So TULIP is, some would say, a nice summary of what Calvin taught, okay? Whereas some argue, actually, it isn't exactly what he taught, and it's what his followers perhaps believed, and maybe Calvin didn't believe everything in TULIP, but for the sake of ease, let's just say that TULIP is what Calvin taught, right? It sums up Calvinism. So what does TULIP say? The first letter of TULIP is T, and T stands for total depravity. So total depravity, what is that? Well, like St. Augustine, Calvin believed that human nature was fundamentally corrupt due to the fall of Adam and Eve, which meant that the heavenly image that we originally created was obliterated in him. We have therefore lost our original freedom and are completely and utterly dead in sin. Our will, emotion, and intellect are destroyed by sin, so we, in this state, cannot respond to God. So even if he comes out to us, we by ourselves cannot respond and say, yes, I believe in you, God, okay, because we're so dead to sin, in sin. And that also means we can't do anything that pleases God at all because of our sinful nature. So only God's grace, like Augustine, can bring us back to this state of righteousness. That's total depravity. We're dead in sin. The U in TULIP stands for unconditional election. Calvin also agreed with Augustine that God chooses those whom he will redeem or save, which are the elect, but he also claimed that God actively chose those who would be damned, the reprobates. Thus, election of those who would be saved is the eternal decree of God, right? The idea that we saw in Ephesians 1:4, where it says, God chose us in him before the creation of the world. Okay, so God, before we were created, decided these people would be saved and these people would be damned. Okay, because God is fully sovereign, he's in control of everything, and he predestines everything. So Calvin therefore believes in double predestination, okay, because God actively chooses those who will be damned as vessels of his wrath. The elect are chosen unconditionally before the creation of the world, meaning it's not based on merit, right, or the goodness of the individual, but pure mercy given, perhaps seemingly randomly, all for the glory of God. So there's nothing you can do to earn God's grace. There's no reason as to why some receive God's grace and others don't, but God chooses before the creation of the world, these people are the elect, I will save them. These people are the reprobate, I will damn them. The elect are made right by the atonement of Christ on the cross. And although we can't be certain as to who they are, right, specifically who the elect are, Calvin claimed that the elect have an inward certainty, known as the calling of God, reassuring them of their salvation. So the elect themselves have this sort of comfort, this inner peace that they are saved by God. Those whom God lovingly chooses to save, the elect, will be justified, which means be made right with God by faith, because obviously we're not right with God because of our sin. But when the atoning work of Christ is applied to the elect, they are made right with God, and that is done by faith. And remember, faith is the way we accept the message of the gospel, but faith itself is also a gift from God. Okay, so that's justification. But also the elect are sanctified. And sanctification is the idea that the elect become continuously more holy and pious, okay, as their Christian life continues. And these two graces, justification, the idea of being like saved, being made right with God by faith, and sanctification, growing in holiness and living an obedient life for Christ, those two graces are inseparable from God. So, once you are justified, you're also sanctified, but sanctification is, of course, a longer process, whereas justification is a one-off event. God then leaves the reprobates in their sins for reasons unknown to mankind, and they therefore sin of their own volition. Remember, the will is still dead, the will is still corrupted by sin, but they still have their own volition, and God actively damns them. Okay, and for some, this idea that God chooses and says, you have no other choice, you can't respond to me, but I choose to actually damn you to hell. For some, this idea is very, very abhorrent, and it goes against the idea that God is omnibenevolent. Okay, and that is, I think, one of the biggest criticisms against the idea of unconditional election and the idea of double predestination, right? That God actively damns the reprobates. Okay, the third part of TULIP is limited atonement. Okay, this is the view that Christ atoned for the sins of the elect only on the cross. Okay, So when Christ died, he didn't die for everyone, but only for those whom he would save. Biblical support, some would argue, is found in John 10:15, where Jesus says that he will lay down his life for the sheep. Okay, the sheep obviously are the followers of Christ, the elect. There is debate, though, about whether Calvin himself believed this doctrine, but it has come to be a Calvinist distinctive, meaning something that Calvinism is known for. Okay, limited atonement, of course, is quite unique and revolutionary idea because most Christians believe that Jesus Christ died for everyone, the entire world. Okay, but Calvinists believe he only died for the elect. Then we have irresistible grace. Okay, so it's God alone who saves and regenerates the elect, producing the gift of faith in them. So even the faith that they have to accept the message of Christ, the gospel, is a gift from God. Because remember, in the sinful state, we cannot respond to God. It's only by God's grace that we can be saved. The elect have no choice but to accept the call of God. So when God chose the elect in him before the creation of the world, he said, I'm going to save these, I'm going to redeem these, and I'm going to damn these. The elect can't say, actually, God, I don't want to accept your gift of redemption. They have to accept it. They have no other choice. Okay? So again, perhaps that poses an issue for the issue of the idea of free will, right? Like how can that be fair if God doesn't give a choice to the elect and the reprobates? And the final part of Tulip is the idea of perseverance of the saints. The elect who have been unconditionally chosen, as we've seen, so unconditionally meaning nothing that they did, just purely randomly and without a reason. They've been atoned by Christ and they've been called by God, cannot lose their salvation. The salvation that God has given to them as a gift. Those chosen by God will persevere in faith and sanctification, right? Justification and sanctification. Remember, they're inseparable graces. They'll persevere in these to heaven thanks to God's saving power. As Jesus said in John 10, that none of his sheep will be lost. And that's interpreted to mean that the sheep, the elect, they cannot leave the flock. They cannot sort of be saved and then not be saved. They will remain saved once God has given them his grace and saved them. Okay, so that's Tulip. Let's look at some of the similarities and differences between Augustine and Calvin. Okay, so we've looked at them both, but you might have noticed that perhaps they have a lot of things in common, but also some differences. So it may seem that Calvin is just repeating a lot of what Augustine says. And it is true that Calvin actually quotes Augustine quite a lot in the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Both authors agree that humanity is fallen and corrupt, in need of God's grace, which alone can save us. However, Calvin goes further with his doctrine of total depravity, which suggests that man is fully dead in sin. Okay, so like fully, absolute. Remember, he said the idea that the image of God is totally obliterated within man. While Augustine maintained that humanity is a massa peccati, a lump of sin, but still with a liberum arbitrium. So the will isn't totally dead like Calvin thought it was. Larry Sharp has also observed that Augustine and Calvin have different views concerning grace, which Augustine sees as a healing power, right? It's healing. For example, in baptism, when grace is given in baptism, it heals the wound of original sin and it heals our nature. Whereas Calvin interprets God's grace as part of his mercy, right? It's given as a gift and it's an assurance of salvation. Moreover, while Augustine taught that grace makes the elect anew by infused righteousness, Calvin claimed that Christ's righteousness is imputed onto the elect, so that we are covered by his goodness but not interiorly changed. So what that means is Augustine is saying that when God's grace is given, when they are made righteous, when they are saved, the elect, actually, their nature is restored back to its original goodness. Okay, and so they are like fully washed. Whereas Calvin said that actually the dead sinful nature remains, but what basically happens is that Christ's righteousness is covering them, okay, but their interior is still the same. The interior still remains dead, but they're covered in Christ. An analogy given by some people to sort of explain the difference between infused righteousness and imputed righteousness is the idea of some dung that is covered by snow. So if the dung is covered by snow, that's the idea of imputed righteousness, because the dung remains, but it's covered by snow. So you see snow, but actually what's inside is dung. So that's Calvin. But Augustine's view of infused righteousness will be that the dung effectively turns into snow. Okay, it's a bit of a crude example, but there's a difference that, Calvin's saying grace just covers us, Christ's righteousness covers us, whereas Augustine says grace makes us interiorly righteous. Perhaps one of the most obvious discrepancies between Augustine and Calvin is the latter's insistence on double predestination and the idea that some are explicitly created for destruction, right, for damnation in hell. While some suppose that Augustine too thought that the damned were predestined, so perhaps he also believed in double predestination, he did also think that we were all created equal in condemnation, and then God chose to save some of us. Okay, and so it's more likely that he taught a form of single predestination, perhaps. So those are the similarities and differences between Augustine and Calvin. We've looked at an evaluation of both of their theories of predestination. Let's finish by looking at some of the challenges to predestination, both Augustine and Calvin's version. So first of all, the idea of free will. Right, that's the most obvious challenge, isn't it, to predestination. Pelagius and Arminius, who we'll look at in a future video, disagree with Augustine and Calvin, and they say that God actually gives us free will. Right, of course, Augustine does recognise that we have free will, and some say that Calvin also does too. But Pelagius and Arminius have a more free understanding of free will, if that makes sense. Because, of course, remember that for Augustine, the liberum arbitrium is inhibited, it's weakened by the fact that we are a massa peccati, a lump of sin. Okay, whereas Pelagius and Arminius take a more open view of free will. The second challenge is the idea of scripture, because some interpret the biblical passages differently, and other passages could be given that perhaps contradict predestination, such as Joshua 24:15, which states, "Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve." Right, choose for yourselves. Doesn't that imply that we have the free will, and that we can resist God's grace, right, against the idea of irresistible grace? Others argue that the scriptures have been changed and are not infallible, meaning they're not the absolutely correct in everything. They can be wrong, such as Reformed Jews. And so maybe the biblical evidence should be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt. Thirdly, we have the idea of meaning, right? What does predestination mean? Some take predestination to refer to the plan of salvation itself, rather than to specific individuals and their actions. So it's rather just the idea of salvation and how that works and how God accomplishes his means, or his ends, but not, he's actively saving the elect and damning the reprobates. Okay, maybe that isn't what predestination means. The fourth criticism is the idea of God's omnipotence and omnibenevolence. Surely, some would say, God could create us with freedom and yet also the ability to choose only the good, right? That's within his power. And also, free will seems to be more in line with God's love. Isn't it more loving that God gives us the opportunity to respond to him and to say yes to him rather than just forcing us, like Calvin says, with irresistible grace? So doesn't this idea that, we are totally dead in sin and there's nothing we can do to respond to God and God saves us without our cooperation, without our choice, doesn't that seem to go against his love? And isn't it possible, if God is fully omnipotent, that he could create us fully free but also always choosing to do the good? Yes, some would say this is a contradiction, right? Because God can't do contradictions, right? Because if God could create us, God can't create us fully free and then also making us always do the good, because making us always do the good means that we're not always free. Okay, so there's a contradiction there. And the final criticism to predestination is basically just a critique of Calvinism. Okay, so there is differences between Augustine's view and Calvin's view. Isaiah 53 in the Bible says, "God laid on him," meaning Jesus, "the iniquity of us all." Of us all. So limited atonement, the idea that Christ died only for the elect, is false and unloving. Right? How is it fair that Christ only died for some people but not for everyone? And it seems that the Bible actually says Christ died for everyone. Double predestination is also unfair and immoral, according to Russell, as we cannot choose to act otherwise. We didn't have a choice. It was God who chose without any cooperation from us at all. And some would say unconditional election is also not just, because it's not based on our holiness or our righteousness or our merit, but just based on God's decree. And we don't know why he decided to save some and damn others. Okay, so that's predestination. We've looked at Augustine's view, Calvin's view, and some challenges to it. In the next video, we will look at determinism, which is the non-religious philosophical view that our actions are determined. But we've looked today at predestination, the idea that actually God has a role to play in determining our actions. Okay, so it's a religious version, if you like. Okay, but that's everything for predestination. Thank you very much.